good luck proving that you have the ability to do so. It is very unlikely you're going to be able to get the benefits that you want on your side of the house. That's the actual benefit of self-governance. If you're still dependent on the Canadian state for all those things, but you now have this certain degree of autonomy, you don't get your benefits. That's really important. Okay, last thing I just want to say about Indigenous people, I think first of all, it's just really, really important the impact that this violence can have. It's already a massive problem in the status quo that people view Indigenous people as someone they have to impose violence upon. That gets far worse when both the police and just people in the community feel like justice isn't being enacted on those people and that they themselves need to take that justice into their own hands. That's going to be far worse than anything Trudeau decides to impose on them in a court, and they have to deal with that on a government to win this debate. I think Indigenous people deserve to know how the law will be applied to them, but also how the extrajudicial violence will be applied to them. It's far worse on that side of the house. Really proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech, and I would now like to welcome up the government member. You're here. Okay. And just a reminder, if you don't wish to be streamed, let org know so that they can deal with that.
Yeah, that's fine. The stream's fine. You can put your POI in the chat, and yeah, actually that's it. Okay, let's start time now. I think the response to the POI you just heard from OO tells you everything you need to know about opening opposition's case, because many of the kind of technical or technocratic complaints that you hear in their case are essentially complaints that could be extended over any kind of self-determination or self-rule in a territory that has been formerly occupied. When they talk about how people won't be willing to include your group in their formal political system, or their courts will treat you worse, or they won't give you welfare benefits from their tax money if they believe that you have your own legal system, that is the exact same way that people would probably think in general if you have your own land and you have control over that land and the Canadian government can't touch it, or if you have your own welfare system under your own Indigenous self-determination and therefore you don't need to be providing for theirs, right? It's a simple extension of that logic. And I think the response that we get is, well, there are so many other pieces that are missing. So what we're going to do in this speech is pretty simple. We're going to very quickly extend on why we think and why we are proud to stand for a world where we do give these people self-determination. And then we're going to explain to you why giving people legal autonomy is a crucial link to ensuring that that self-determination is actually workable, why removing that piece is the thing that actually damns their self-determination to eventually be wiped away, and why that is then the most important consideration in the round on a pragmatic basis. So firstly then, in terms of what do we support? We say that insofar as Indigenous people were uniquely stripped of their ability to self-govern, the thing that they were denied was not just their land, but was the ability to decide the fate of Canada, a territory that they were in for hundreds of years prior to the original Canadian government. It's not enough for us to say that we're going to give these people in-kind benefits like welfare systems or in-kind benefits like 5% representation in the Canadian Parliament optimistically to restore that kind of self-determination to these people, right? The freedom to choose what they wanted was what was stripped from them, so that's what they require in principle. There are three separate reasons why we give Indigenous people unique leverage to protect themselves from onslaught against their self-determination, and therefore create the best chance that Canadian Indigenous people will exercise meaningful self-determination in their jurisdictions. The first reason why is legal synchronization. So I think a lot of the technical complaints you heard from opening opposition, which is that there are lots of different groups, and maybe these different groups disagree with each other about what the law is, are precisely reasons why the Canadian government has a very, very powerful incentive to negotiate with these groups, and these groups having leverage in hand to try to create some degree of legal synchronization so that these groups can have functioning legal systems. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that the Canadian government probably wants a world where certain types of crimes are respected as bad regardless of what jurisdiction that is under. They don't want people robbing banks all over the place, though I don't think that Indigenous groups would tolerate that either. And they also probably want general ability to interact with these groups when it comes to things like trade, when it comes to things like property exchanges, when things like joint ventures, for example, on Canadian lands that the Indigenous people actually do opt into. So in a world where this massive legal transition exists, there's a very, very strong incentive for the Canadian government to say, we're giving you back all of your autonomy. In exchange, can we request that some specific things are done so that there is some degree of harmony across these multiple group systems, certain common law principles that are respected. And we're not saying that Indigenous people accept this outright outright, but we think that this gives them then tremendous leverage to say that we would accept these basic principles that generally have broad consensus in exchange for certain concessions from the Canadian government, in exchange for example, you better respecting our land rights, in exchange for example, investments that are made on our land, giving meaningful revenues to us insofar as investments that were made on another Canadian territory's land would give meaningful revenues to those people who lived on those lands, right? So there's a huge amount of leverage, at least in the short term, to ensure that these groups actually get protections from the Canadian government in exchange for recognizing basic common law principles that makes this transition significantly easier. The second reason why we give Indigenous people substantially more leverage, though, is that we protect their land. And I want to be clear that we're going to differentiate from OG here, who did flag this argument for about 1 minute and 15 seconds total across their two speeches. But I want to answer some of the things that OO said and talk about why this is important. The OO says that, well, this is not a significant portion of land. It's just small swaths of land in British Columbia. Most of the development is going to happen on those lands, right? Our argument would be as follows, is that when you give at least the small portions of land that Indigenous people own their own control, it's not that Indigenous people will not participate in allowing the Canadian government to go onto those lands, but that when the Canadian government does need to go through those lands, which we think is probably just likely to be true in some number of cases, and the Canadian government tries to force them to accept new developments, the Indigenous people now have some kind of meaningful check. That is, they can say that we are pragmatic and we would prefer that there are some kind of developments that occur that are economically viable, but also that you can't seize these lands through eminent domain and then not compensate us for them in the way that you might compensate other people for them who lived in Canada. Or you can't not give us tax revenues, for example, when you develop on these lands. And that then means that it's far more likely that any kind of meaningful developments that occur do so under the purview of Indigenous control rather than under the purview of Canadian control, which can be used at any moment. I also want to note that the fact that the Canadian government has the power to seize this land at any period in time then gives the Canadian government right now a tremendous amount of leverage to do basically anything they want to Indigenous people, addition to land, because these people know that if they don't tolerate what the Canadian government does, their land will be taken away from them. The third and final thing that we do, though, is that we protect the civil liberties of Indigenous people. And this is an area that I think has been completely unanalyzed by opening government. That is, right now, many of the prosecutors in Canada use the ability to prosecute Indigenous people in a specific way. They use them for targeted cases that aid the self-interest of the Canadian government. And what that specifically looks like is locking up people, for example, for protesting new developments, or jailing people who are going against the injustices of the Canadian criminal justice system and the injustices that exist in the country writ large. Opening up.
Yeah, so can you please explain how marginalized people who often don't have access to drinking water have leverage over a state who apparently can just seize their land at any time, according to your own arguments?
They can't seize the land on our side of the house, and the reason they have leverage is the reason that I gave, which is that the Canadian government still has an interest in there being some degree of legal harmonization. They still have an interest in developing, et cetera, et cetera. The final thing I'm saying here, though, is that there are a huge amount of Indigenous people who currently protest government actions and can be locked up right now under Canadian law, which then discourages people from participating in any kind of demonstration, protest, etc., against Canadian overreaches, because there's a huge risk to one's personal safety and security if they choose to do so. On our side of the house, we directly make that impossible. That includes police, by the way, jailing people, because if a police jails someone for a crime they didn't commit, then the police has actually done something wrong, and there's legal recourse against that police officer that exists on our side that doesn't exist on their side, by the way, right? And so that is then a reason why more people can protest and serve as a bulwark against action. The threat of collective action then discourages the Canadian government from engaging in these broad overreaches and forces them to the table to engage. Brian will explain to you why giving people the ability to protect their land and their self-determination is the most important consideration in the round. But I think the most important thing to note is that all of the things that they talk about that could get potentially bad have much, much more potential to get worse in a way in which this land is eventually stripped away and it doesn't come back. This is the first step to dealing with some of the problems that they talk about. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the government member for that speech, and I would now like to welcome up the opposition member. Here.
Hi, just checking whether I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel. The reason why self-governance, liberty, and all these things intuitively are very persuasive to us as liberals is because it gives us this like subconscious freedom of thinking that we have washed our hands off of the feeling that we have blood on our hands. And the reason why I say this, panel, is because all the principal arguments of self-governance, self-determination that come from both OG and CG only materialize if they prove that there's enough efficacy. Because if you consider the principle standalone, of course, GovBench is winning. Because obviously, GovBench is telling you that, you know, we're giving people back the rights that we have taken away from them 100 years ago. But I think, panel, under no circumstance have they shown to you that, like, incentives that exist to continuously capture and oppress these indigenous population somehow isn't more heavy than the incentive of allowing them to be by themselves. They assume and fiat that suddenly we have the capacity to let them be, because apparently we historically have done so. Three things then. First, I'll talk to you about how change has occurred internally in the Canadian government and why we should keep on supporting it. Second, I'll talk about the benefits of Indigenous people. Lastly, I'll talk about inclusivity in the greater Canadian scene. First, in terms of why change has occurred. Look, I'm going to be the first team to tell you why, even though the Canadian government might be trash, it is trash that has significantly improved due to Indigenous minority activism. 4 next year. First, because there was a waves of protests in 2022, 2021 by Indigenous activists that A, changed the fishing and hunting laws in a lot of Indigenous land, B, solved a lot of residential discrimination that occurred in places like Toronto and British Columbia, which is an indicator that mobilization has substantially increased. Second, we think people like Indigenous populations have become more and more aware about how historically data shows that their votes have been a swing in key states. And Trudeau, again, if you look at Trudeau's political patterns, they have quoted to that. 4, because of international outrage of the Canadian government. The Canadian government runs a facade of being diverse and having a diverse cabinet. But in the General Assembly in the UN, etc., and also the UN, the Human Rights Council, has consistently battered the Canadian government for the rights that they don't give to Indigenous population. But 4, cabinet positions for Indigenous communities have doubled over the past 6 years, which essentially shows to you that there is more political inclusion of Indigenous populations from themselves. They are more aware, they're more active, and they again vote for their own Indigenous population. Now, this is the wave hand response from all Ivy League and EPL people that, oh, guess what? It doesn't mean anything. Panel, minority activism means a lot, because if CG's argument is true that we need to let minorities advocate for themselves, they themselves understand that minorities want inclusion in the Canadian government, because that's what they freaking advocate for, right? Which means that we don't need to show that things have automatically changed. We just told you that minorities themselves want to be included, which I also think flips OG, because a lot of OG's premise is that minorities want to self-govern. Second, let's talk about why it doesn't benefit Indigenous people. Look, I think OO, while they did a good job in questioning practicality, this argument assumes that OG and CG can be salient, all right? And I'll still tell you, under their perfect world, why still minorities don't get benefit. First, because I don't think this is meaningful power. Even in the best interpretation of these Indigenous courts and Indigenous legal systems, panel, you must understand that their legal system doesn't have the web of network and coverage of the most crucial parts of society. That means Indigenous courts will never have authority over multinational corporations, will never have control over state apparatus, which means, panel, even in a world in which an MNC is told that you do not have a right to enter my land, and they Indigenous population wins that court case, then they go to higher level Supreme Court and things like that. The issue, therefore, is, panel, there's a imbalance of power of what courts takes precedent over the other, which means, panel, that shows that you cannot say that just because they can now fight with MNCs in their courts, they automatically get fiat, because they don't. Because when MNCs who have a lot of gerrymandering power, a lot of corporate power, go to these Supreme Courts essentially win these vote on the favor of the MNCs and the police anyway. But the second reason why these courts aren't going to be powerful under your world, because it feeds legal system precedent, which means that legal systems bounce precedent off another. They refer to what one court ruled in its history and do it back and forth. I have no idea why Supreme Court, who is so fucked according to CG, will have any incentive of using legal systems like that are so detached from their own mechanisms. All in all is to say, Pan, the counterfactual is that under our world, we keep on including the people, like the people of indigenous communities in our legal system, so that we have more indigenous lawyers, we have more indigenous like judges, things like that. Again, I have told you that the wave has started. You are the one, like GovBench has to face this trade-off. That they're like Canadian government, to show that they have suddenly become very progressive and has allowed them to self-determine, suddenly goes like, you know what? We are giving you rights, go deal with your own problems yourself. The incentive to deal with your own problems doesn't exist. Before I move on, OG.
You don't just have to prove that there is progress, you have to prove that you stop police officers from being racist and incarcerating people disproportionately, and why we can't also have progress on our side.
Again, because I told you that police is beholden to the Canadian courts. Police is not beholden to the indigenous courts, which means police, if they want to like be brutal, can be brutal, because under your world, you take all of indigenous activity and place it on a different court, which means the incentive to reform law doesn't exist under your world. Second, let's talk about why this is literally the opposite of choice. And this directly, again, like battles both like OG and CG. Look, when more and more people under their world leave the Canadian legal system, the few indigenous people that want to stay and still fight within the Canadian system are the ones who now become a bigger minority. Look, panel, I'm not trying to tell you that minorities have a lot of traction in these sorts of spaces, but you're literally limiting the choice of accessing Canadian legal system, the more in which Canadian legal system can go like, X amount of your people have now gone to indigenous courts. We don't have to cater to you anymore, which means if there were 100 lawyers under our world in indigenous British Columbia, it now shrinks, and which means that people who live in these cities, who are not, again, secluded everywhere, don't have access to like literally like indigenous lawyers under their world as compared to ours. For all of these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition member for that speech, and I now like to welcome up the government whip. Here.
Okay, cool. Am I audible? All right.
Yes.
Timer real quick. I'm going to talk about three things in this debate. Firstly, I want to discuss the principle and show you why Devesh's analysis, differentiating us from opening government, wins us purely on the principle clash. Secondly, I want to talk about the bargaining chip and explain to you why not only are the harms that are accrued from police important in this debate, but rather that a bargaining chip can present a vast array of benefits to indigenous peoples that has not been discussed by any other team in this debate. And lastly, I want to talk about civil liberties, describing what actually are the differences between the current legal system and the new legal system, and show you in terms of a bottom line framing why it is that self-determination is only protected by closing government. So the first thing I want to do then, all rebuttal will be integrated. The first thing I want to do then is talk about opening government's principle, right? Because I think opening government actually does a very good job in terms of powerfully showing us why it is that there is an impetus and an obligation to improve reparatively the lives of indigenous people. But what Devesh does is two things here, right? The first thing that he explains to you is that the reason why we specifically need to give them access to their own legal systems is that self-governance was one of the things that was taken and needs to necessarily be returned. And because self-governance is a link that is crucial to your self-determination, the only proportional way we can return this is by giving the legal system itself, that no other alternative reparations, like closing opposition's alternative system of just like allowing them to have more access to the system, having 5, 10, 15% representation in the courts, is ever going to be enough when it comes to repairing the previous grievances that we have put upon these people. But the second thing that Devesh explains to you is that insofar as we still debate within OG's principled framework, we are the only team that can actually prove to you why we get a vast swath of benefits that can actually match the reparative obligations that we require to face when it comes to indigenous people. So the second thing I then want to talk about is just that, right? Why is it that on a bargaining chip level, beyond just, the harms that police officers are committing against Indigenous people, that we can actually accrue benefits and protections like on every level? What Devesh explains to you here is very simple, right? The legal system and the land rights that we grant Indigenous people are not only important insofar as they serve their own practical benefits, but also that they are a bargaining chip that can allow us to create a mutually beneficial system that can both help the Canadian government achieve middle ground that they want with the Indigenous people, but also necessarily build up a community of Indigenous people that aren't going to be bereft of resources as opposition wants to describe, right? And notably here, what I think opposition doesn't understand, and they kind of highlight in the POI to Devesh, is that they don't really get what the comparative is, right? The eminent domain where Canada has the ability to take away the land of the Indigenous people exists in the status quo. And the reason why this is so important is because every government policy is done and negotiated under the premise that Canada has an absolute control over how Indigenous people get to live, where they get to live, and what rights they get to retain. The difference then on our side is because you are given the ability to self-govern, you also can then use this as a tool to reform the systems that fail you in the Canadian government itself, which notably also rebuts a lot of the analysis coming out from closing opposition, right? What are the claims from opposition that might address this? Opening opposition brings us two claims here, I think, right? The first thing that they say is, well, you can't magically solve issues like the pipeline issues and land right issues instantly, right? And I agree that to a certain extent, this may be true. But what Devesh is explaining to you that is different is that the act of this being a bargaining chip, coalescing with the analysis coming from closing opposition about how Canada has been more privy to giving more benefits to Indigenous people, means that you necessarily can create mutually beneficial projects, right? This looks like pipelines that used to dump waste into Indigenous lands would no longer do so, but maybe they could still pass through Indigenous lands, yet also benefit the communities, right? Building mutually beneficial infrastructure that can promote both the lives of Canadian people and also the lives of Indigenous people at the same time, right? The right to be able to defend yourself and protect yourself from the harms of these projects does not mean you can't also benefit from them. And the only way you reach these mutually beneficial conclusions is with the leverage that Devesh explains that you can get on our side of the house. The second thing opposition side wants to claim is this idea of backlash, right? The idea that legal and political rights could then be denied in a future world. The reason why this argument fails is twofold. Firstly, note just how uncomparative this argument is on face, right? This already happens. The only difference is not only are your legal and political rights being tried to be denied by the conservatives within your country, you also stand in a double jeopardy where you don't get to live by your own system that would otherwise have granted you legal and political and land rights, right? But secondly, even when it does come to the marginal change that happens in this debate, know that opposition never really frames to you what this change is likely going to look like. And the reason why they do so is I would say that the marginal change in terms of how many more conservatives start hating Indigenous people is likely going to be a change that is so insignificant and is a bullet that we can bite, considering the amount of upliftment that is likely going to happen to the communities that still live within Indigenous lands. Lastly, then I want to address a few closing opposition arguments on this front, right? The first thing that they tell us is, but the Canadian government has improved. I would say that this contextualization only proves to us why OO's harms of political backlash are less likely to happen, and why our arguments about bargaining and leverage are more likely going to lead to cooperation. They then say, but what about the people that are going to be left behind? I would say two things. Firstly, note the fact that for the vast majority of people who decide to leave, they're uplifted to a degree at which you can't compare it in the status quo. But secondly, and more importantly, I would say Indigenous communities have incentives to protect themselves, right? This includes people that might not live within the boundaries of their lands. But even the people who do choose to completely leave behind Indigenous communities, I think it makes perfect sense if they want to choose to live in Canada's government under their Canadian citizenship, under their Canadian governance, right? In those cases, they would no longer identify as Indigenous people. It would be perfectly fine for them to live on their own then. Lastly, then I want to quickly address civil liberties in a bit of bottom line framing, right? I think the most important thing to note here is that right now, Indigenous self-determination is being stripped away. Their land is being taken and their rights are being whittled away. Note that these changes are sticky. There's no political capital to give new land to Indigenous people. Once they are wiped out, they are gone. There will not be enough Indigenous people in the legislature on either side of the house to reverse these changes. This is a huge harm and probably the greatest harm in this round for two reasons. Firstly, these are their homes and they cannot move. Their culture, their religion is tied to the locations from which they were born and grew up. These things have tremendous cultural importance to people that exceeds specific material goods that they can get from the Canadian government, even in the best case of opposition. People construct their lives around these things, and that is all that they know. Secondly, note that this is prior to all of the benefits that they want to talk about. All of the problems they want to talk about, like the government stripping people of their rights, jailing people without care, and taking away welfare, can only be reversed if Indigenous people have leverage. We uniquely give it that. I am very proud to propose.
I thank the government work for that speech, and I would now like to welcome up the opposition work to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
All right, just confirm that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
All right, time starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, obviously debating about Indigenous motions is always difficult because there's a very complex group, and I don't think that any of us really have the right to speak for people that we are not a part of. I think on principle, we all should support land back, and the most principled form of justice is one in which the Canadian government leaves and lets Indigenous people govern the entirety of Canada that was once their own. Having that said, though, differentiating from OO, then we'll talk a little bit about self-determination, and I'll talk a little bit about the practical procedural implementation of this policy. Firstly, what does CO tell you? We tell you two really important things. One, that change is happening and has created the potentiality and the impetus for change is one that you lose at the point at which you create Indigenous courts that mean that the Canadian government or the Canadian society as a majority oppressor no longer feels a need to identify with Indigenous people as a specific group that needs to be uplifted, and that is essentially traded off. This trade-off is never compared against by any side on government bench. The second thing we tell you is that there's a large amount of people, including Indigenous politicians and lawyers, but also just people who live within urban centers in Canada who are left behind by this policy. The reason why this is important, because in many ways, those are the most vulnerable actors insofar as they're less likely to be able to find any form of connection with their Indigenous courts, but secondly, probably face worse end goals when this policy is enacted, i.e., if an employer within Toronto is unclear as to whether or not an employment dispute or some dispute within the workplace is going to be resolved by the local court or by an Indigenous court, is probably less likely to want to hire an Indigenous person because they know that that the ruling might not go in their favor at the point at which that person will be taken back to a Indigenous court. I think this largely means that on net, the life path and opportunities for Indigenous people who aren't on Indigenous land actively get worse because most likely it means that police brutality, but also just basic microaggressions and discrimination probably get worse because people are less likely to want to engage with those things when they know that it won't always rule out in the majority's favor. I think this is never meaningfully contended with, and I think it largely wins this round. I think it outweighs OO because we see that even if Indigenous courts are really good and function in the most fantastic and utopian ways possible, there's still drawbacks and trade-offs in the long-term change for inclusivity and economic development, but also in the individual life paths of the most vulnerable Indigenous groups within this motion that are lost, and that trade-off is never contended with. I think CO is clearly winning this debate. Firstly, on the principle, the first argument we get from OG is talked about self-determination. We will give you a number of reasons for why this is not actually self-determination. Firstly, it's not reparative at the point at which these groups are still underfunded and excluded and structurally discriminated against. All of Srian's analysis about the ways in which activist protests have largely been able to court a majority, some level of sympathy from the majority, or have allowed for greater representation within courts, or have even just recognized that Trudeau might be willing to swing votes in the next election term, are all lost at the point at which these courts are now seen as separate, and therefore the life paths and the upliftment of Indigenous groups are no longer important to the Canadian government. Secondly, it's not actual self-governance. Look at Srian's analysis of how structural systems such as the Supreme Court or even higher level courts are probably still likely to go in favor of MNCs and corporate rulers that pollute over those lands, and therefore you're not actually giving them any real tangible self-governance over the land acquisition, but probably over individual cases of prosecution. They can't be out in that these courts are powerful enough to negate the corporate lobbying that takes place. But thirdly, just weigh it, right? Weigh whether or not you are free when you're isolated, i.e., if you're as an Indigenous court are now isolated and have no form of recourse over the other systems of power or legislation in Canada, you're probably more isolated, and socially you lose the capital as a means of like gaining sympathy over fence sitters in the Canadian majority. And therefore, likely, I think your self-determined outcome actually gets worse at the point at which people's economic life paths are worse. And means for the individual person, the self-determination comes at the cost of like a better life. I think that's not a very good principle to stand on. CG then adds two new layers of analysis. The first thing it tells us is that it creates legal synchronization, i.e. the government is likely to negotiate in favorable ways when it comes to like trade ventures or like developmental aspects. One, I think it's probabilistically untrue at the point at which you exacerbate, you essentialize that Indigenous communities are like different from you. I think this largely means, one, that corporate investors are probably less likely to want to invest in those places and build pipelines in the first place if we take you at your best case where Indigenous courts are able to rule over the land, right? That probably means that corporate investors don't want to go there because they know that decisions will never be made in their favor if the Indigenous court goes against them, i.e. this means investment goes down, you're probably not likely to get those like favorable ventures. But secondly, we see that like the only meaningful way in which these negotiations work in favor of Indigenous people is if the Fed gets involved. Recognize that throughout 2020, the biggest issue for Trudeau has been federal overreach. This was the reason why his father was taken out of office. This is the biggest criticism he is being given. If the Fed was to come in and negotiate between, say, like conservative majority areas like Alberta over whether or not Indigenous people should get more favorable negotiations when it comes to corporate trade ventures, I think this probably creates greater backlash on the Fed level, and again, reduces any policy for like better upliftment of Indigenous folks in the long term. Before I move on, OG.
Our policy is clearly not mutually exclusive with activism, but activism is also much harder when you're being harassed by the police, impoverished, or incarcerated.
So that's my next point, the civil liberties argument. They tell us that prosecutors will use Indigenous court to protect protesters from being like harassed. Three responses to this. One, it likely means that protesters will face more violence outside of Indigenous land. Look at all of OO's analysis about police now feeling they have to take the law into their own hands. This likely means that protesters now have to protest on Indigenous land. Two reasons why that's worse. One, it's less visible, i.e. the urban center doesn't get to see those protests and therefore is never able to meaningfully engage with that activism. Secondly, you get a distorted perception of Indigenous communities as being like ruckusy and like engaged in insurrection and chaos that likely feeds into the over-criminalization narrative. The final thing I would say is just weigh this argumentation, right? One, change is happening and is possible, and you hamstring that at the point at which you isolate those communities and mean that they can never meaningfully interact with urban centers the way that Sriyan tells you that they are right now. And secondly, inclusivity just gives you more self-determination, right? Like at the point at which you are more included, more likely to get jobs, more likely to get lawyers who vote in your favor, you probably have a better life for a wider breadth of Indigenous folk who live in urban centers and on Indigenous land than you do on the other hand. Final piece of question on practicality. They tell us that we can use these Indigenous courts to block pipelines and like stop pollution. One, corporations are unlikely to stop. Secondly, land ownership isn't always based on private grounds, i.e. a lot of land on Indigenous groups are communally owned and therefore are probably going to be negotiated amongst Supreme Court decisions, not Indigenous like prosecutory courts. This likely means that on channels that exist that are disputed, i.e. the river channel that goes between Wet'suwet'en territory is likely probably going to be given in favor to corporations, i.e. the pipeline that goes through there and pollutes that river will probably continue to pollute that river. Also, land that is proximate to those will still continue to pollute. Weigh this again, you lose the ability to get rid of those in the long term, and that activism is hamstrung, or when the ability for those courts to negotiate is hamstrung. Proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition for that speech, and once again to everyone for an excellent debate. Once again, congratulations everyone on making it this far.